I hate the Tyranids, not in the "oh no, they're scary" kind of way, and not even in the "they've ruined my army list" kind of way. No, I hate them because they could have been so much cooler. They had the potential to be one of Warhammer 40,000's most unique and terrifying factions, one that combines alien horror with overwhelming force. But instead, they've been trapped in a cycle of being underwhelming on the tabletop, repetitive in the lore, and a narrative dead end in the larger story of the setting. Now, before you start typing an angry comment about how I just don't get the Tyranids, let me make something clear. I want to like them. I want them to be the nightmarish, apocalyptic horror that the lore promises. But time and time again, the execution falls flat. Today, I'm going to break down exactly why Tyranids can be frustrating, not just to play, but also to read about and engage with as a faction. We'll talk about how their gameplay is a logistical nightmare, how their lore is disappointingly shallow, and how their role in 40K's grand narrative makes them feel like a cosmic side quest rather than a true existential horror. If you're a Tyranid fan, don't worry, I'm not here to say you shouldn't enjoy them, but by the end of this video, you might just see why so many players and readers find them more frustrating than fearsome. Now let's dig in. Before I tear into everything wrong with the Tyranids, let's give credit where it's due. Their design is incredible. If there's one thing that Games Workshop nailed with this faction, it's their aesthetic. The Tyranids are a perfect fusion of insectoid features, crustacean characteristics, and deeply unsettling, almost human-like body horror that makes them one of the most visually striking factions in Warhammer 40,000. First, let's talk about their biotechnological aesthetic. Tyranids aren't just alien monsters, they're living weapons. Every piece of their biology has a purpose, from the chitin plating that acts as natural armor to the bioorganic guns that grow and fuse with their bodies. There's something uniquely unsettling about a race that doesn't just wield weapons, but is the weapon. Unlike other factions that rely on machinery, the Tyranids have completely abandoned traditional technology in favor of a fully organic war machine. Their firearms don't fire bullets, they launch living ammunition, acidic bile, or parasitic spores that burrow into their enemies. It's an eerie, almost Lovecraftian take on evolution. Then there's the swarm aesthetic, which perfectly captures the nightmare of an all-consuming alien force. Tyranids take inspiration from some of Earth's most terrifying creatures: ants, termites, locusts, and deep-sea horrors, but crank it up to an apocalyptic scale. Their smaller units, like termagants and hormagaunts, move in massive waves, overwhelming enemies through sheer numbers. But this isn't just a mindless horde. There's a terrifying intelligence behind it. The hive mind orchestrates them like a vast, organic war machine, ensuring that every creature, no matter how small, has a role to play. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their design is their body horror elements. Unlike purely insectoid aliens, Tyranids have an eerie, almost human-like quality to them. Their elongated limbs, gaping maws, and exposed musculature give them an uncanny resemblance to something that almost looks familiar but is entirely wrong. Creatures like the Hive Tyrant and the Lictor don't just look like bugs. They look like something twisted from a nightmare, a fusion of predator and prey that feels like it shouldn't exist. This is what makes them so effective as horror creatures. They aren't just monstrous, they're unnervingly close to something that could have come from a darker, alternate path of human evolution. The combination of insect, crustacean, and almost humanoid features makes the Tyranids visually distinct from anything else in Warhammer 40,000. While chaos is grotesque in its mutation, and the Necrons are eerie in their cold, machine-like efficiency, the Tyranids tap into something far more primal. They're a vision of biological perfection gone wrong, a force that exists solely to consume and evolve, and their visual design perfectly encapsulates that terror. It's honestly a shame that this is the best thing about them, because if the rest of the faction lived up to the sheer brilliance of their design, we'd be looking at one of the most compelling threats in all of Warhammer 40,000. Instead, well, we'll get into that soon. For all the terror they're supposed to inspire in the lore, playing Tyranids on the tabletop can often feel less like commanding an unstoppable alien swarm, and more like trying to herd a chaotic mess of fragile models while dealing with inconsistent rules and mechanics. They're a faction that should be terrifying to play against, but instead, they often end up being frustrating to play as. One of the biggest issues with Tyranids in gameplay is their sheer logistical complexity. At their core, they are a horde army, meaning they rely on overwhelming numbers to function. This sounds great in theory, but in practice, it turns every game into an exhausting exercise in micromanagement. Moving dozens of small, individually weak models across the board is a nightmare, especially when positioning is critical. If you misplace a single squad, you risk breaking your formation, losing synapse support, or giving your opponent the perfect angle to wipe out your carefully constructed swarm before it even reaches combat. Then there's the synapse mechanic, which is both essential to the faction and a massive liability. The idea is that smaller Tyranids need to stay within range of larger synapse creatures like Hive Tyrants and Warriors to remain under the control of the Hive mind. But this creates a paradox. Tyranids are supposed to be a terrifying, all-consuming force, yet a few well-placed shots taking out synapse creatures can suddenly turn them into a disorganized, panicked mess. It means that, instead of playing like an overwhelming, adaptable force, Tyranids often feel like a glass cannon with very specific weak points. If your opponent understands this, they can exploit it to completely shut down your army before it has a chance to function properly. Beyond this, Tyranids have suffered from wildly inconsistent power levels across different editions. Sometimes they're borderline unplayable, struggling to keep up with factions that have stronger durability, ranged firepower, or psychic abilities. Other times, they get a massive buff that makes them overwhelmingly dominant, only for Games Workshop to inevitably nerf them into oblivion again. This cycle makes playing them feel less like mastering a faction and more like rolling the dice on whether they'll even be functional in any given edition. While some factions have consistent strengths they can always rely on, like Space Marines being well-rounded or Necrons having strong durability, Tyranids seem to oscillate between being too weak to compete and so strong they get hit with the nerf hammer immediately. And then there's the issue of model upkeep. Because Tyranids rely on swarming the board, you're often forced to paint and maintain dozens of gaunts, gargoyles, and other smaller creatures just to field a decent list. This is a massive barrier to entry, especially for new players who might be excited about Tyranids' aesthetic, but quickly burn out when they realize they have to paint a small mountain of gaunts before they can even start playing. Other Horde factions like Orcs at least make this process fun, with each model having personality and variety. But with Tyranids, unless you really love painting the same carapace and claws over and over, it can quickly become a monotonous grind. All of this results in a faction that should feel like a relentless, evolving force, but instead feels like a logistical headache. Playing Tyranids isn't about being an unstoppable swarm. It's about constantly babysitting mechanics hoping your synapse creatures don't die too quickly, and praying that you're in an edition where they're actually viable. And that's a shame, because as we established before, the design of the Tyranids is brilliant. They look like they should be a terrifying presence on the battlefield, but the way they actually play rarely lives up to that expectation. Instead of feeling like the tide of an unstoppable invasion, they often feel fragile, unwieldy, and at the mercy of whatever edition rules happen to favor them at the time. For a faction that embodies the idea of an unstoppable, apocalyptic horror, the Tyranids in the lore are surprisingly boring. Not in concept, because, as we established earlier, their design is phenomenal, but in execution. Their presence in the Warhammer 40,000 setting has largely remained stagnant, and when they do appear, it often feels like they're running on a predictable, repetitive script. One of the core issues with the Tyranids in the lore is that they lack real narrative depth. They are, fundamentally, a faceless, unknowable force of nature. Unlike Chaos, which has legions of individual characters and internal politics, or the Imperium, which is filled with intrigue and conflicting ideologies, the Tyranids have no central figures, no distinct personalities, and no meaningful conflicts within their own faction. The hive mind is an omnipresent intelligence, directing its forces with terrifying precision, but it has no voice, no personal stakes, and no motivation beyond endless consumption. While this certainly makes them feel alien and inhuman, it also makes them one note. They arrive, they eat, they move on, rinse and repeat. This ties into the second major issue. Their stories all play out the same way. Every Tyranid campaign follows a predictable formula. A hive fleet arrives, the Imperium, or another faction, desperately tries to hold the line. The battle is long and brutal, and either A, the Tyranids are eventually stopped at great cost, B, they consume the planet and move on, or C, some mystery remains about what the hive mind is really up to. The problem is that this structure has barely evolved over the years. While other factions undergo changes, face internal conflicts, or have new developments that shift the status quo, the Tyranids feel static. They are always growing, always consuming, but never meaningfully changing. Their entire narrative presence is a perpetual threat on the horizon without actually being part of the greater narrative in an engaging way. Take, for example, the Tyranid invasions we've seen in major 40K events. They show up, they devastate a sector, and then they either get stopped or continue on their way. The fall of Shadowbrink, a horrifying battle, but ultimately just another story of Tyranids versus Imperium. The Octarius War, a fascinating concept, throwing them against the Orcs to see which mindless war machine comes out on top. But ultimately, it has dragged on for years with no real impact on the setting as a whole. Even Hive Fleet Leviathan, the biggest and most dangerous Tyranid incursion, followed the same basic formula. This is what makes them frustrating as a faction. They should be the ultimate existential threat, the unstoppable wave that forces the galaxy to unite or perish. Instead, they feel like a background noise that the setting refuses to truly commit to. They exist in a strange limbo where they are too powerful to be properly defeated, but also too repetitive to be interesting as an ongoing narrative force. They can never truly win, because that would destroy the setting, but they also never evolve in a way that makes them more engaging. And that's a shame, because there was so much untapped potential in their concept. The Tyranids could be used to explore the horror of an enemy that can't be reasoned with, an intelligence so vast that even the greatest minds in the galaxy are mere insects in its eyes. We could see hive fleets adapting in new ways, developing unexpected strategies, or even fracturing into rogue elements that create unique stories. But instead, we just get the same invasion story, again and again, with no real stakes beyond how much biomass was lost this time. For all their strengths in design, the Tyranids in the lore feel like an afterthought, an ever-present menace that never actually moves the setting forward. They are a faction that should be terrifying, unpredictable, and constantly evolving. But in the grand scheme of Warhammer 40,000, they are predictable. And in a setting defined by its endless conflict, that might be the worst thing they could be. After breaking down the Tyranids from multiple angles, it's clear that my frustration with them isn't about their design, which is easily one of the best aspects of Warhammer 40k, but rather the narrative limitations that come with them. Their role in the setting is ultimately stagnant. Their lore feels repetitive, and their lack of ideological depth makes them less engaging compared to other major factions. That being said, none of this means the Tyranids are bad. They're just a faction that I personally find underwhelming, and that's okay. Just because I dislike them doesn't mean they should change. Warhammer 40k is vast enough that different people can find different things to love. In fact, the very aspects of the Tyranids that frustrate me, their overwhelming simplicity, their purely instinctual nature, their lack of personal conflicts, are exactly what makes them appealing to others. Some people like the idea of a mindless, all-consuming horror that exists outside of politics and ideology. Some people enjoy the fact that they don't have individual characters or dramatic betrayals, and that's completely valid. At the end of the day, it's probably best to accept that the Tyranids fill a specific niche in 40k, and that niche just isn't for me. If they were changed to be more complex, to have ideological depth or personal struggles, they wouldn't be the Tyranids anymore. So while I may not enjoy them, and while I find them narratively frustrating, that doesn't mean they should be different. Maybe they're just fine the way they are, for the people who love them. So, if you're a fan of the Tyranids, I hope you got something out of this, even if you disagree with me. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.